Welcome to Savage Bites Season 3. This episode is entitled, We Don't Take Plastic. Hey Carlos! Jared's precise, almost mid-Atlantic accent cut clear through the buoyant din of voices swelling in the smoke-veiled interior of the little taverna. He clicked his fingers impatiently. A sharp, solid snap called forth by square, sculptural fingers. A flash of white teeth set in that taut, thinly stubbled jaw. A self-assured wink followed it, carelessly tended to the pert little piece sat across the table from him. She was new. He didn't know her. But he would. One look was all it took to recognize his type, the privileged North American tourist. Or as he, and the rest of his generation would have it, traveller. His long-limbed, easy confidence, those pale, chiseled features buttressing a prominent Roman nose, black eyes, steady and assured beneath thick brows, all framed by a breaking wave of oil-black locks. He was 19, but he held court at the ramshackle hostel bar like the elder statesman, audacious yet poised, his audience tacitly aware of their lesser status and content to bask in the reflected glory of their unelected Tsar. "Hey Carlos!" he repeated, favouring his entourage with a winning smile. "Another round for the house, on me! A fresh bottle of tequila, and shot glasses!" He laughed, his voice raising in enthusiasm to a hedonistic howl. "So many shot glasses for everyone in this motherfucking shithole!" He laughed again, absent-mindedly elbowing the girl to his left roughly aside to fist bump his wingman, Chris, completing the ritual on the second attempt as their combined drunkenness threw the first awry to a hail of good-natured laughter. Jared had met Chris playing beer pong in a bar in Cusco 3 weeks before. Against the odds, they'd struck up an odd but compelling friendship. Jared led the way, and Chris followed him into incidents and adventures he would never have rooted out on his own, whereas Chris, with the restrained idiosyncrasy of the British, tempered the worst of the Americans' excesses. They'd been travelling together ever since their chance meeting, first wandering south to the coast, and then east across the border into the wild high mountains of Bolivia. Chris was alright for a Brit, a bit dull, tame and timid, inhibited by youthful self-doubt, and by the big strange world around him in ways that had simply never occurred to Jared. The British lad was poor enough company, Jared reflected, as his eyes slid over the pert breasts of the local girl opposite him, breasts barely concealed in a taut white vest top. But he was a sight better than the rest of these hillbilly locals, fucking Bolivians and Peruvian migrants or whatever the fuck they were, that made up the bulk of the gathering. The local boys mildly irritated Jared, but they were necessarily an intrinsic component of the place, merely bit-part players in the backdrop of his travels, present but barely acknowledged, save for one or two, whose hard eyes occasionally lingered on his and displayed a degree of insolence that ought not be wholly ignored. They were in his way mostly. It was the girls he was interested in. The girls. They were okay, he shrugged, for a night or two anyway. In truth, he admitted, they were more than okay. Hot, sleek little factoids they were for the most part, an even coffee-coloured tan from head to toe, pointed tits and tight slits, and best of all, poor as poverty, and desperate to please, and all too willing to pleasure him in whatever way he saw fit to use them, for a chance at sharing in the flashy American's abundant supply of US dollars. Jared smiled to himself through his drunken haze, confident and assured of his top dog status in this dingy backstreet bar in the middle of ass-fuck nowhere. And there it was again, his father's voice welling up out of his subconscious to berate him. That disapproving tone present in all the nuanced condescension of the man himself, as though he stood before him in the flesh. So wholly had his critical persona engraved itself into the boy's subconscious mind. The merest notion of the man syringing another piquant drop of poison into Jared's soul, tainting the moment, as it had so many times before, tarnishing everything he did, a spreading inkblot of resentment and doubt, seeping, spreading through the crisp white pages of his history. He licked the sticky strip edging the paper contemplatively, sealing the fresh blunt before lighting it and taking a long draw. "Just as long as you keep paying the bills, Dad," he muttered under his breath, a dense roll of smoke unfurling, masking the sardonic half-smile that briefly touched his lips. He downed the biting shot of tar-black tequila proffered him by the dark-eyed teenager across the table, with a momentary grimace. For now, he would ignore her lingering gaze. Who the fuck did the old man think he was, anyway? Did he think he had all the answers? Of course he did. In the old man's mind, Jared's future was mapped out in every detail. A life of affluent success and duty to family and community. In short, to fulfill the role of the good son. The son a father could be proud of. To Jared, it was all so fake, so contrived. He knew his father resented him dropping out of college, and was keenly aware of how the old man squirmed inside when friends inquired after Jared and his doings. Sometimes Jared suspected that this had been the spark. He recalled his elation at the discovery of a chink in that armour of indifference, of a pressure point he could exploit, where he could dictate terms for once, even in this small way. Yes, he was certain of it now as he downed another shot. It had been the realization of power, slight as it was, that had led him to ditch his scholarship at Yale, to quit the preordained path that had curbed him in for as long as he could remember. He had headed south then, to travel, drifting, concealed among so many others of his age, who each felt that subtle, almost indefinable urge to find themselves. He was not one of them. He knew who he was. Instead, his was a search for freedom and for debasement, a hedonistic dereliction of duty, a vengeful shedding of obligation, and the pursuit of dissipation in lust and drink and drugs, all of it orchestrated in the service of one goal, the spurning of his destiny and the defiance of his father's will. Surfacing from the silent depths of his introspection, the present moment returned, flooding in around him, a deluge of sound and motion, the clamour of intermingling conversations, underscored by the passionate candour of Spanish rock, the tart smells of alcohol and sweat, the heat of bunched bodies blending with that of the tropical night, the soft blur of smiling, laughing faces in the gloom of the candlelit taverna. Screw his father anyway. He was a confirmed asshole, and Jared didn't give a shit about his straight-laced opinions. Besides, he smiled, what the fuck could he do about it from half a continent away? Jared caught the eye of the girl across from him, the one who'd been watching him all evening. She was pretty in that crude and sophisticated sort of way the locals had. He took a long lazy draw on the blunt as he held her gaze. Pinching it from between his lips, he offered it to her with a glint in his eye and an inviting flash of dark brows. The girl shrugged shyly, and a delicate hand appeared, but he shook his head with a wolfish grin, turning the smoke over as she watched him. He slotted the lit end between his teeth, leaning over the scrapwood table that divided them. He presented it to her, inviting her to take it in kind. A small hand found his among the toppled shot glasses. Their lips met in a long, lingering kiss, the blunt artfully discarded at the last possible moment, left to drown on the tabletop amid a slick sheen of spilt hooch. A warm shaft of sunlight woke him, bathing his naked chest with a rejuvenating heat. Outside the open window, the bush was alive with a distant hum that rose and fell on the breeze. The low, lulling drone, mingling with that of the passing vehicles on the narrow main street out front, was periodically punctuated by the far-off calls of birds, away among the forested hills that loomed above the squalid little village. The girl beside him was naked, save for a twist of cotton sheets trailing across her ass. Jared cast an appraising eye over her supple honey curves, edge-lit in the golden light. Smiling sardonically to himself, he lifted the edge of the sheet, exposing her. He sucked his teeth at the sight, then quietly reached for his cell phone on the nightstand. Smiling into the camera, he glanced at her. "Hey Chris," he whispered, "check it out, mate. This is going straight on Pornhub." Slowly, he panned the camera across the lithe form of the naked girl, before moving in close to examine her ass and the dark space between her slender thighs. Ending the recording, he forwarded it to Chris, and returned his phone to its place on the nightstand. Beside him, all unknowing, the girl stirred and rolled over onto her front, with a squeak of sleepy satisfaction. Judging from the vague montage of dim memories swimming in his mind's eye, she'd shown him a good time, and persevered with him despite the coke-fueled droop that had always afflicted him, tolerated the caustic mood it had provoked in him. She'd been sensitive, taking her time and gently coaxing him erect. Somehow, that only made him resent her further. For a moment, he considered fucking her again, but his hangover and a swelling sense of agitation made that an impossibility. Fuck it, he thought. Once had been enough. She'd had a good time. That was a conceit, he knew that, and was comfortable with the notion. There would be others. Lots of others. He smiled again at that. No girl deserved more than one role with the champ. The abrupt vibration of the cell phone was jarring in the quiet stillness. That would be Chris, he thought, snatching up the handset with a sly smile, eager to ascertain his associate's reaction to the video he'd sent. Instead, he was confronted with a message from his father, pecked out in the man's characteristically clipped phrasing. Have secured you a brokerage position in Sempiternity Capital on Pearl, which is frankly more than you deserve. Be there Monday morning, 9 AM sharp. Let me down this time, and you're on your own. I'll cut you off. Dad. Jared stared at the screen for perhaps a full minute without moving. The cold, hollow sensation that had begun in his gut spreading through him, leaving him anxious and irritable. He felt trapped somehow, affronted by the finality of his father's statement, by its bold and mitigated delivery, appearing as it had out of thin air, an A-bomb of harsh consequence dropped into the lap of his indolent, self-indulgent luxury. He checked his watch. It was just after 11 AM, Sunday morning. He had less than 24 hours to get from ass-fuck nowhere Bolivia to New York City. There was no confusion now as to his course of action. He would go. The prodigal son returning to the fold, or the whipped dog brought to heel. His ingrained conceit dictated that he frame it in his mind as the former, but deep down, in the lower reaches of his subconscious, in a place he would never have thought to look, a secret part of him knew that the latter better described the visceral reaction he'd had to his father's command. Swinging his legs out of bed, Jared hastily hammered out a curt text to Chris. Meet me in the lobby in 10. He packed his rucksack quietly, dragging a fresh t-shirt over his head and wedging his feet through board shorts and into flip-flops. He checked his wallet, finding its remaining cash and cards safe. Then, passport in hand, headed silently for the door. He paused on the threshold. With a disdainful shrug, he ripped a 20 from his wallet, screwed it up, and flicked it onto the bed beside the sleeping girl. The latch clicked behind him as he closed the door. 2 minutes later, Jared stood, impatient and agitated, at the scrapwood reception desk in the lobby. Reaching over it, he hit the bell repeatedly, its cracked minor note ringing hollow and forlorn in the still interior. A minute or so later, the hotel's owner emerged from the shadows of a back room, irritably scratching the back of his head, his eyes puffy from sleep, his vest, the same one he had worn the previous night, grubby with tequila stains and armpit sweat. Hey, what's your problem, man? I need to get the fuck out of here. Get my bill. Jared sniffed arrogantly, agitated under the burden of this new and unaccustomed deadline. You okay, bro? Carlos inquired, his eyes showing genuine concern as he slid Jared's bill across the desk. I'm fine, Jared muttered curtly, his dark eyes on Carlos as he peeled a wad of notes from his thick wallet, counted out the correct sum marked on the bill, and tossed them nonchalantly onto the battered wooden counter. There was just enough cash remaining to cover it. Carlos collected the notes, licking his thumb before counting them out slowly as Jared waited in growing impatience, his eyes on the door. His task complete, Carlos grunted his approval. You're good, man. Jared nodded, and then he spoke again, and as he did so, it was with a more convivial tone. Carlos, when's the next bus to La Paz? Carlos glared at him, deadpan, for perhaps half a minute. It's Sunday, he muttered matter-of-factly. There's no bus till tomorrow. Jared drew a deep breath of exasperation, his eyes swiveling toward the door, as though watching his future disappear through it, leaving him lost and destitute, 3,000 miles from home. But I need to get to La Paz by tonight, said Jared coolly. There's no bus, muttered Carlos. You just have to wait. No, I can't wait, Carlos, okay? Fuck the bus, Jared snarled. You can drive me. Carlos lifted his eyebrows at that. Why are you in such a hurry, bro? Why not wait? Take the bus tomorrow. Because I need to get out of here, that's why. Because I hate the stinking buses in this country. Stuffed with peasants and chicken coops and fucking goats. And I'm sick of this fucking place. He gestured vaguely around him. Is that reason enough for you, hombre? Carlos threw his hands up, irritated and provoked by the American's candor. Are you serious, bro? Jared leaned over the desk. Yeah, I'm fucking serious. I want you to drive me to La Paz. Carlos shook his head and was about to speak when Jared cut him off. You see this? Jared snapped his fingers and was suddenly brandishing a gleaming black credit card. This is a black Amex card, bro. There's no credit limit. His smile was thin and there was nothing friendly about it. I can buy anyone and anything I want with this card, Carlos. And I want you to drive me to La Paz. Carlos shrugged, unmoved by the American's arrogant claims and secretly relishing the boy's obvious discomfort. Sorry, bro, Carlos muttered in mock sympathy. I can't just leave the hotel and play taxi for you across half of Bolivia. Sure you can, said Jared. I'll make it worth your while. Carlos paused and his voice fell to a level just above a whisper. Look, man, I ain't driving you over the mountains. It's too late. He checked his watch briefly. It's almost noon already. You know it's a long drive, man. It's too dangerous to be up there after dark. I don't give a fuck, Carlos. I need to get to La Paz by tonight. I'm trying to tell you, man. It's no safe. There's a reason they call it the road of death, you know? That's just tourist crap, Carlos. Please spare me. Jared scoffed. I tell you, man, it's a bad place after dark. People go missing. People go up there, and they don't come back. Carlos shook his head in honest concern. You should wait till tomorrow. Get the bus. But Jared was too preoccupied to hear him. Okay. Rent me a fucking car then, he challenged. The hotel owner was taken aback at that. What? Rent my car to you? Carlos looked the boy up and down appraisingly. Why the fuck should I? Yes, Jared nodded encouragingly. Rent me that piece of shit Citroen you got parked out front. Why? Jared gazed at his man sidelong. For money, dumbass. Look, it's just for like 1 day. I'll give you, what? He tapped the black Amex card on the desk impatiently. $500, okay? $500 American for 1 day's rental. What do you say? Carlos licked his lips. I say 1,000. His face deadpan. 1,000, muttered Jared, nodding incredulously. Carlos, I want to rent it, not buy the fucking thing. 1,000. That's the price. Take it or leave it. Carlos, I always liked you. No, I gotta say, man, I'm beginning to reconsider. Carlos grunted and moved. His eyes locked on Jared's, his face a blank mask of indifference. Jared sighed. Fine, he gestured. It was his father's money, after all. What did he care? Whatever, 1,000. You got it. Carlos eyed him suspiciously. How do I get it back? And how do I know I will get it back? Dude, I don't want your piece of shit car. I want to get to La Paz airport tonight. I'll leave it in the parking lot. Just put little Freddy on the bus to La Paz in the morning. He can collect it for you. I want a deposit too. Carlos snarled, both hands planted defiantly on the desk. 2,000 American. 2,000. Jared repeated to himself as Carlos pecked out the details on the card machine. Scowling, Jared jammed the black Amex card into the dirty slot, signing the little receipt spat out from the little slit at its base with a brusque flourish of the pen. $3,000, muttered Jared. It's a pleasure doing business with you, sir. Carlos smiled, tossing him the keys. I bet it is, muttered Jared. I'd better get that deposit back, Carlos. And I'd better get my car back. Without a scratch, mind you. On the cracked pavement outside the hotel, Jared sparked up a Marlboro Red, sucking in the acidic tang as he savoured his last look at the village street. The split asphalt, punctuated here and there by the roadside by shabby palm trees. The string of battered vehicles parked at irregular intervals along the curb. The ubiquitous litter of paper and faded plastic rubbish heaped like a broken high tide line against the footings of the ramshackle buildings. What a fucking dive, he muttered to himself, as though seeing it clearly for the first time since his arrival. Jared! Hey, Jared, mate! Chris came hurrying out the front door of the hotel, his shirt unbuttoned, his hair awry from the pillow. I'm tired of this shithole, Jared said, gesturing vaguely. And you? Chris shrugged, nonplussed, at this sudden turn in his friend's demeanour. I'm taking off. Getting the fuck out of here. Carlos lent me his car. I'm gonna take the road of death back to La Paz. Jared spat into the dirt at his feet. Then, looking up, he caught Chris's eye. Want to hitch a ride? He took another pull on the cigarette, squinting levelly at the Brit. It's supposed to be pretty killer. Chris paused, pondering. He glanced down at the street before answering. That video. That's not cool, mate. She's only like 16 or something. You can't put that on the internet. It's not right. Not right, Jared sneered. 16 or not. She's a fucking whore. Some other tourist will be banging her by tonight. Maybe it'll be you. Why the fuck do you care? Chris held his gaze, watching Jared's silhouette in the sunlight. I don't know. It's just not right. Jared shrugged carelessly. Too late, mate. The deed is done. Then Jared paused as a thought struck him, his handsome face cracking into a malign half-smile. You like her, don't you? Chris looked away, a hot flush touching his neck and ears. You should have said, mate, Jared said flatly. Chris's throat moved. Listen, said Jared. No hard feelings. You can stick around here if you like. Who knows, with me out of the picture, you might get to fuck whatever her name was. He grinned, flicking his cigarette butt dismissively to the roadside and crushing it with his heel, his eyes never leaving Chris's. Me, I'm out of here. Before Chris could object further, Jared wrenched open the door of the old Citroën and dropped into the driver's seat, slamming the door shut behind him with the characteristic clang of 1970s French engineering. Bemused at this bewildering exchange, Chris watched from the roadside as the Citroën 2CV's engine spluttered into life, and the little car puttered slowly away from the curb and off down the narrow street, pursued by a thin streamer of blue smoke. A mile outside the village, Jared pulled over onto the forecourt of the run-down gas station that squatted beside the road, filling up the Citroën's small gas tank at the station's solitary pump. He paid with the Amex card, and distracted as he was with time and distance calculations, and the anxiety as to the long and convoluted journey ahead, he barely noticed the total on the bill presented to him by the sullen cashier. He signed the printed receipt and left without a word, wholly unaware that he, like all but the most savvy of travellers passing through these parts, had been heavily overcharged. He wouldn't have particularly cared, even had he noticed the discrepancy. This was no time for quibbling over pennies. He had a plane to catch, and there were 200 miles of treacherous, twisting mountain roads between him and the international airport at La Paz. The drive up into the mountains began well enough. The lower reaches of the road were broad and at least partially maintained, and were largely walled in on either hand by ancient towering trunks, whose canopy closed overhead to form a sort of natural tunnel. Occasionally, as the road climbed ever upward, the trees would give way to reveal startling vistas of Arcadian beauty, where verdant jungle slopes would drop gently away into the misty river valleys winding below. And at times he caught glimpses of the far horizon, so many miles away, where purple peaks bit the hem of the sky's blue mantle, with snow-capped teeth. As time wore on, and the miles rolled beneath his wheels, the ceaseless ascent continued, and as the altitude grew, the Citroën's little engine began to suffer, coughing and spluttering intermittently as it fought for breath in the increasingly rarefied air. With every mile the quality of the road deteriorated markedly, till at last the gruelling ascent was little more than a narrow shelf, gouged roughly into the face of a sheer cliff. For the most part it was wide enough to drive with comparative confidence, but ever and again he would come to a place where the path ahead narrowed further, where the crumbling edge had given way and the broken surface of splintered stone presented a perilous obstacle that could not be avoided. Each time he encountered such a place, he would slow the car to a crawl, inching the little citron cautiously across the loose shale, coaxing it onward like a skittish animal, as the low afternoon sun drenched the blank stone monoliths of the high pass in gold. The citron's small motor gave up the ghost just as the road began to level off, the attenuated air at that altitude having detrimentally affected the fuel-air mix, had stressed the engine's rudimentary cooling system beyond the breaking point. Now she was done. The machine sat at idle, at the edge of the sheer drop, thin tendrils of steam rising from the seams of the hood. A little tinkling waterfall spilled down through the ferns that clung to the wall to his right, spilling out across the road from the heights of the cliff looming above. Little crosses decorated with fresh flowers perched at the lip of the abyss just up ahead, where the road narrowed further, and its crumbling edge fell away into a sheer descent to the forest canopy, perhaps 1,000 feet below. He was marooned, stranded on this godforsaken strip of deserted, ill-maintained road. To the west, the sun was already dipping toward the mountains, and soon it would set, leaving him alone in the dark. That's just terrific, snarled Jared. He ripped the door open and swung his legs out of the cramped seat, slamming the door hard behind him. So hard, in fact, that it rebounded, swinging open again with a hollow, quavering clang that echoed off the cliff walls around him in the silence of the late afternoon. I should have known this piece of crap would die on me, he muttered bitterly to himself. Thanks, Carlos. The futility of blaming the man, of blaming his father, or the old car, or anyone but himself was not lost on him. But he shunned rationality. Instead, favouring a cathartic venting of his pent-up frustrations, he contented himself with a solid kick that left a noticeable dent in the driver's door. Without pausing to think, he popped the hood to examine the engine, releasing a sudden gout of hot steam that billowed into his face on the instant it was released from the confines of the engine bay. He staggered back, waving it aside, coughing and spitting out the hot metallic taste of the scorched radiator, swearing again at this fresh vexation. As soon as the offending cloud had dissipated, he returned to look over the engine, but to no avail. What did he know about mechanics? Nothing. He'd never even thought to look under the hood of the new BMW M4 his father had bought him. Why would he? He got in it, drove it. It worked every time. How the fuck was he going to get this piece of crap going again? How the fuck was he going to get to La Paz in time to catch his flight? How the fuck was he going to get to New York by Monday morning? Suddenly struck by a thought, Jared fumbled for his cell phone, but of course there was no signal. How could there be up here in the mountains, so far from civilization? That was the final straw. Angry at the cruelty of circumstance, and at his own impotence, he span on his heel and bellowed into the void. The distant echoes of his voice sounding small and frail against the backdrop of such immensity, against the bland indifference of the world and of the universe itself. Dislodged from the cliffs overhead, several stones skittered across the road a few yards in front of the car, the pattering of the little waterfall all but masking the sound of their falling, and the soft, furtive padding of the footsteps that had loosened them. Bent under the arched hood of the car, Jared was oblivious to all save the confusing puzzle of the engine. He cursed again, scratching his head, his scalp itchy with pent-up agitation. It was perhaps their high-pitched chatter that finally caught his attention. Surprised and relieved at this good fortune, he stepped out from beneath the hood, an easy, ingratiating smile on his handsome face. "Hola," he said in that friendly, offhand, confident manner he habitually affected, marvelling as he did so at his own luck in meeting a group of locals here in this desolate place at such a late hour. Perhaps they could help get the car going, or at least provide him with a ride to La Paz. The little knot of figures gathered some way up the road were silhouetted against the sun. They froze at the sound of his voice, but said nothing, their eyes gleaming inquisitively in the failing light. Jared held his smile, Fucking hillbilly locals, he thought to himself. Say, do any of you guys speak English? Habla inglés? He said uncertainly. I could use a little help. The group began to move as one, creeping cautiously and silently along the narrow ledge that formed the road toward the young American. Say, can you guys help me out here? Jared said, indicating the old Citroen with a wave of his hand. My car seems to have broken down. Jared took a pace toward them, and again they froze in place. Do you think you could get it going? He shrugged. I have no idea how to fix it. If not, he wondered aloud, maybe I can catch a lift? The figures stood rooted to the spot, dark statues edge-lit in the glare of the setting sun, motionless save for the subtle pulse of their breathing bodies. I can pay, he exclaimed, suddenly brightening. Jared dug in his pocket, and a moment later retrieved the shiny black Amex card, brandishing it high, smiling brightly with his perfect white teeth. Along the narrow ledge, the shadowy group recommenced its advance in furtive silence, and for the first time Jared noticed the emaciated condition of the approaching figures, their queer, hunched posture, the low-slung, crouching gait they exhibited as they crept soundlessly toward him. The tribe was old, very old. Its people had walked the earth since time immemorial. Though the tribe was not plentiful in number, they had endured through the ages. When the others came, they were not daunted by the rivalry. Instead, they accommodated them, turning circumstances to their advantage, keeping to themselves in their way, preying on them when opportunity arose. In time they came to regard them only as fresh meat, to rely on them for sustenance. There was something inhuman in their twitchy bird-like movements that now began to unnerve Jared, and as he watched their silent approach, the tiny hairs on the back of his neck began to lift in growing alarm. I can pay, he muttered, his voice dying in swelling confusion. The boldest member of the group suddenly sprang closer, and now, as the light fell across it, Jared caught the reflected gleam of feral eyes full of hate and animalistic bloodlust. The thing, not quite a man, though not exactly a beast, cracked a smile then. That smile was wider than that of any human, and within it was revealed an irregular arrangement of glistening, needle-sharp fangs. It was on him before he could react, savagely biting his hands and fingers as he fought in desperate confusion to fend it off. It had all happened so suddenly that his mind still struggled to pass the reality of what was happening to him as the mass of them fell upon him. They raised the sharp teeth, sinking deep to rend the bare flesh of his hands, face, and throat. With a hoarse shout of pain and horror, he fell heavily to the gravel under the writhing weight of gnashing, clawing feral forms. The bus shuddered to a halt with the squeal of worn brakes. Inside, it was hot and stuffy, and alive with the muddled chatter of conversation. Outside the grimy window, the noon sun glared down on the naked rock of the high pass. "What's the matter now?" inquired Chris, wiping sweat off his forehead with the heel of his hand. He leant into the aisle to get a less restricted view forwards. Beside him on the shabby bench seat, Freddie shrugged imperceptibly, saying nothing, just gazing out of the window, resigned through long experience to accept the vagaries of South American bus travel with a stoicism alien to the Brit. Impatient and exasperated by his companion's apathy, Chris dropped out of his seat and made his way to the front of the bus through the bustle and throng of the chatting locals. The driver too was out of his seat, and the folding main door was retracted, allowing a gentle breeze into the humid interior. Chris could see the driver through the glass, standing beside the broken-down vehicle that partially blocked the road. Several men stood with him, locals Chris recognized as fellow passengers. His curiosity piqued, he hopped down onto the road, taking care not to get too close to the yawning cliff edge just a few feet away, and moved to join the little knot of men near the car. Carlos's little Citroen 2CV was empty and abandoned, its hood propped open, and there was a dark patch of something smeared on the dusty road near the front tyre. Chris inched closer to get a better view, all at once intrigued, yet somehow reticent as to the thought of what he might find. He pushed his way past the elbow of the bus driver, who was conversing rapidly in Spanish with another of the passengers. Though he didn't have more than a smattering of Spanish, Chris caught some mention of police before his attention was wholly gripped by what he saw lying on the ground. Crouching in the gravel, he tentatively reached down to retrieve it. It lay in a sticky pool of congealed blood, and though partially chewed at the corner, was clearly recognizable as Jared's black Amex card. You have been listening to Savage Bites, Season 3, Episode 25. We don't take plastic. I hope you enjoyed this story. Yeah, it's been a little while since I've uploaded any original content. I've been a little sidetracked with lots of client work and obviously a new arrival of my son, who is gorgeous and well behaved, but the sleep deprivation does hamper one's concentration somewhat. So Savage Bites has taken a little bit of a hiatus, but Savage Bites is back. Season 3 is now underway. Episode 25 is in the bag. Yeah, like I say, I hope you enjoyed it. There's more coming. Again, this season is going to be 12 episodes. Some of them are already written, some of them are already illustrated. They're all mapped out to a greater or lesser extent. There should be a much improved frequency of uploads moving forward. Yeah, so please, if you haven't subscribed already, then please do so, because there's lots more cool content coming your way. If you're already a subscriber, thanks so much for sticking around and bearing with me while my upload rate has been a little sparse. Yeah, so lots of exciting stuff coming for 2021. Okay, I'll see you guys in the next one. Cheers.